The 2024 legislative session is finished, but not without some drama. Lawmakers passed some major items, but left Medicaid expansion on the table. Now attention turns to the race for the White House, and it looks like it's going to be a close one. Political analysts Austin Barbour and Brandon Jones join us with plenty to chat about. Also,
I think this is the first point of engagement on what will be a series of hard decisions, hard conversations as we go forward.
the Mississippi Municipal League's Toby Barker offers his thoughts on the Public Employees Retirement System, and that's all ahead this Sunday on Mississippi Insight. We are at an interesting point in Mississippi's 2024 political season. This year's legislative session has just ended, and now campaigning for the November elections is in high gear. We are joined today by two well-seasoned observers of state and national politics. Austin Barbour is a Republican strategist and a managing partner of the Clearwater Group, and former state lawmaker Brandon Jones is political director of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Action Fund and new majority PAC. Gentlemen, welcome back to Mississippi Insight.
Thanks for having us.
Let's get to the questioning. All right, thank you. Hey, we know that both of you are keeping a close eye on the race for the White House and congressional control, but let's talk some state politics first. We just ended a very busy session of the Mississippi legislature with some big ticket items in play. What are your takeaways? Austin, let's begin with you.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there were some issues that Republicans, who of course hold supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, they had a lot of successes. Whether you talk about education, they successfully negotiated from the House and the Senate position a new education formula that will put over $240 million more dollars into K through 12 education in Mississippi. That's a tremendous success. It was supported by Republicans and Democrats throughout the legislature, and it was an issue that was very important to Speaker Jason White and, of course, to Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann. Infrastructure spending, which we can talk about in more details. There were hundreds of millions of more dollars that were put into infrastructure to widen highways in places like DeSoto County, Lafayette County. Last year, there were hundreds of millions spent Jackson County, Madison County, and up in other areas in northeast Mississippi. So these are big issues that matter, that were big successes for leadership on the Republican side of the legislature.
And Brandon, what have your takeaways from the session?
Well, it's hard not to lead with Medicaid expansion. You know, it's worth noting that for the first time, a bill not only got out of committee, but made it all the way to conference. That is significant. And hats off to Republicans and Democrats in both chambers for pressing the issue. But at the end of the day, nothing changed. And so Mississippi has once again failed to join 40 other states, 80% of the country, in providing health insurance to people who cannot afford it. And so that continues to be a black eye and one that we need to remedy as soon as possible. I join Austin in applauding our legislators in both chambers for increasing public education funding to the tune of $229 million. That's a big deal. And infrastructure, that you heard Austin mention it a moment ago, that is, again, another issue that had broad bipartisan support. I think as we look ahead, what you'll hear some Democrats talk about is, how do we make sure that we're paying attention to those parts of the state that aren't often included in the big expenditures? And so those places west of 55 and parts of the Delta, that also continue to need attention. And then perhaps also, how do we find some type of consistent funding source for these infrastructure projects so that it doesn't have to be that MDOT comes hat in hand to the legislature every several years?
Yeah, we can include the new education funding scheme and changes to public employees retirement system as accomplishments this year, but not so much Medicaid expansion as you've been talking about. So Brandon, there was a lot of momentum behind this effort in both chambers. Why couldn't lawmakers get there in the end?
Well, look, the Senate kind of wrongheadedly wanted to put a poison pill into the bill that would have totally knock the whole legislation out if the federal government did not give Mississippi a waiver for a work requirement. Now, the problem with that, Byron, is that, first of all, no one would even qualify for this program without having some source of income. So it was a little bit of a misnomer for this requirement to be in effect. But the other problem is that the federal government has already turned down 13 states who have sought this requirement. They found that it really doesn't enhance workforce participation, and it doesn't do the things that some members of the Senate said it would. And so that was always going to be a problem for Democrats to support the idea of a work requirement that, if not awarded, if the government didn't do something that it hasn't done in recent years, would have killed the bill. And so obstinance around that issue was a big problem. But I think at the end of the day, we just kind of ran out of time. In all truthfulness, I think there were members of both parties who were working hard. And unfortunately, there wasn't that last bit of political will to make the necessary adjustments to get something that could pass by a broad 2/3 margin. Again, though, as disappointing as that is, I think we would be remiss if we didn't point to Speaker White, Democratic leader Robert Johnson, members of the conference committees for the work they did to try to get it there. Because I do think it was a sincere push, and not for nothing, but Lieutenant Governor Hosemann, who I've been pretty critical of during this process, did say at the conclusion of the session that it would be a top priority heading into next year.
Austin, your thoughts on why they didn't get it done?
Well, they got really close, as Brandon said, but I'll tell you, this was my 20th legislative session, and it's really rare that you pass something as monumental as this and you get it done in one session. Okay, this is the first time that Medicaid expansion has had a full debate at the state capitol ever. So to see it get so close and not pass is not shocking. I think Brandon just said that the lieutenant governor is already sort of positing, hey, we want to deal with this during the off season. We want to have hearings. We want to talk to people and take a look at it for next session. But listen, the Senate and the House both had different ideas. They both wanted to get something done, and ultimately they just came up a little bit short. But it was not for a lack of effort and for trying and wanting to get something done for the working poor. And yes, having a work requirement was really important for Republicans. And also focusing on, the two different groups, the people who make up to 99% of the federal poverty level, who just, if you're in the 77 and 99% bracket, you don't have coverage right now unless you're sort of lucky because of what you may have from a part-time job. So that was what the Senate was focused on. The House was focused on trying to maximize federal dollars, but they got really close. They had a robust debate and conversation that I'm sure will continue into the off season, and then we'll see what happens next session.
What sort of grades do you all give the legislative leadership, both the Senate President Delbert Hosemann and the new House Speaker Jason White? Brandon, begin with you.
Yeah, look, this is sort of like grading the NFL draft immediately after it's over, Byron. It can be kind of tough to know exactly where things stand immediately when we're done. But based on what we saw, I would say for a first-time speaker and for someone who set out a very ambitious course, but who also did make efforts to work with the minority party in his chamber, I have to give Jason White good marks. So I think for a first session and for accomplishing what he did and for making some efforts, although improvement could certainly happen in the years ahead, I'll give Jason White an A- because I do think he did as well as we could hope for out of a new speaker taking on a lot of big topics. I think it was a little bit of a mixed session for Lieutenant Governor Hosemann. As many of your viewers know, he campaigned on Medicaid expansion years ago when he was seeking the office of Lieutenant Governor. And he got outflanked during this session by the governor, who does not want Medicaid expansion. And we spent a good bit of this session without Lieutenant Governor Hosemann really empowering his members of the Senate with his vision for what expansion would look like. So while I agree with Austin, this is a very tough thing to do in one session, I think the Lieutenant Governor could have done a better job of casting vision and leading on the Medicaid expansion issue. And because he didn't, I'm going to give him a C-, Byron.
Austin, your thoughts on how you would grade them?
I don't think anybody really cares if I give somebody an A or an F, but I'll just leave and say I think both chambers did a great job. As Brandon said, this was Jason White's first session as a new Speaker of the House, moving up from the number 2 position that he held under former Speaker Philip Gunn. He did a great job. He was very ambitious. He took on 4 or 5 serious issues, and most of those he had success with. And to be able to move the debate on Medicaid expansion, he immediately passed the ballot initiative. It's the first big issue that he passed, and we didn't find success on that. Very successful session. And I'd say the same thing for Lieutenant Governor Hosemann. Everybody always knows the Senate is much more the deliberative body. They're going to sometimes take a little more time as they're looking through issues. And those 2 houses, those 2 chambers work very well together. You mentioned PERS. I should have mentioned PERS earlier. That is so important to so many people who are watching this program right now. They shored up PERS. They put I think $110 million of new cash into that program. They made some changes to how PERS increases can go to the employer match. They did a lot of important things that were big victories. And I have to go back for 10 seconds more in education. Republican leadership, when Tate Reeves was lieutenant governor and now is governor, has just really done amazing things. It's called the Mississippi Miracle by the national press for the test scores and improvements we've made in education. And this legislative session, they put $240 million more into that. Those are, if we were giving grades, those are really good.
Let's look ahead now to November, where we're in the middle of a very close presidential race. The polls in key battleground states are tilting in Donald Trump's favor, but often within the margin of errors. Austin, what do you think about this race and where we stand today?
I mean, I don't think anything probably different than anybody who knows about national politics. It's going to be very close. I mean, that's the situation that we're in. We've got 2 candidates who have extreme popularity with smaller bases amongst their party, both Biden and Trump, but who have a lot of support with those groups. Those are very passionate parts of their base. And what they've got to do, whether you're Trump or Biden, is figure out, how do I get a broader group of Republicans if you're Trump and independents, and then Democrats and independents if you're Biden. It is who can win those groups, who can get those folks within your own party, and those who may lean a little bit left if you're Biden or right if you're Trump, to show up in November to vote for you. That's going to be the key to this election. But it's going to be a really interesting 5 to 6 months to watch. Are they going to debate? Or are they not going to debate? There are big things to see. How do both of them, who are on up there in age, they both are, how do they hold up to the rigor of a presidential campaign, which is, it's the hardest thing that you can do, is to run for president.
Brandon, how do you see this race right now, where the polls stand today?
Yeah, well, it's incredibly close. I think for me, Byron, I care less about national polls, and I pay more attention to state polls. And because as you all know, we of course decide our elections based on the count of the Electoral College. And if you look at the state numbers, there's some good indicators for Biden. This has been, we're living at an incredibly divisive political moment. And so I think we can anticipate this one to be close, just like they all are. But if you look state by state, Biden has shown increased improvement in places like Wisconsin, in places like Pennsylvania, and in some of these states that have been important for helping him to win 4 years ago. So I think that's going to be the story. We will continue to pay close attention to those places, those handful of states that are going to have so much to say in the final outcome. And we probably will not have a whole lot of clarity until we get to Election Day in November.
I don't think there's any question that Trump is the slight favorite right now. I look at sort of the same polling that Brandon has, and I think it's gonna ebb and flow of where the polls are favoring. But coming into the summer, it is clear that Trump's got a slight lead over Biden, and we'll see if he can hold it.
And Austin or Brandon, I'll start with you, Brandon. Do you think this is going to come down to a race on personality, or will this be a race about policies?
Look, I think that the Biden campaign desperately wants this to be a race about policy. And you're going to see them spend a lot of effort pointing to successful legislation that's been passed and economic and other successes that they feel really solid about. And so they're going to spend a lot of money on that. And it should be noted that, in campaigns, in order to get your word out, you have to spend money and you have to advertise in these key battleground states. The Biden campaign has a significant advantage over Trump in this area. The other problem for Trump is that he doesn't appear to be spending his money in very strategic ways right now. It's not that big of a secret that a lot of money from the national committee level down to the campaign level is going towards paying lawyers, where he's defending himself in courtrooms across the country. He's not spending money in battleground areas. He's not spending time in those areas. And at some point, that's going to be a problem. If he can't execute a campaign in a manner that's talking to those voters that are going to be so key to the outcome of this race, that's going to be a problem. Whereas Biden appears to be running on all cylinders with a pretty sophisticated operation in those states that are so vital.
Austin, is this going to be policies or personality?
Well, I mean, Brandon's my friend, but I just totally disagree with him on this answer. If it is on policy, Joe Biden's in trouble. I firmly believe that, from immigration to the economy, with inflation, what's happening on college campuses right now. I think it's a real problem for Joe Biden if this is an issue, if this is a race that's more focused on policy than maybe the personality of President Trump. So if it's a policy race, this is one that Trump is not just going to squeak by. He may sort of rest comfortably on election day, but we'll see. It's Brandon's right. I mean, where these two campaigns go over the summer and then into the fall as they have their conventions, we'll see. And there'll be lots of curveballs that are thrown that they have to react to, and it's going to be very interesting to watch.
We have congressional elections as well. Mississippi's own races may not be very competitive, but Brandon, control of the U.S. House and Senate are very much in question this November. What are you watching out for?
Yeah, it's going to mirror very much what we just said about the presidential race. These margins are going to be very thin. Last year, 2 years ago, there was prediction of a red wave. As we all know, that did not happen. The Republican-controlled House of Representatives has just kind of slowly gotten even more close than it was 2 years ago. And there's something about sort of this constant state of speaker wars going on in Congress that I'm not sure has helped Republicans in any significant way. So I think it'll be close again. Similarly in the Senate, there's only a handful of places that could tip control there, but it's going to be a very narrow margin either way. So again, I feel like we're saying the same thing, but it's just a very polarized time in our country's history, and I think we're going to see the presidency and the legislature reflect that.
Austin, what are we looking for?
Look, I'm looking for the Republicans to hopefully win control of the Senate. I'd like to see our senior Senator Roger Wicker as the chairman of Armed Services. That'd be a great win for Mississippi if Republicans can take control of the Senate. But Brandon's right. It's going to be close. Republicans are probably the odds-on favorite to win the Senate. The House, I just don't know what's going to happen there. I do agree with Brandon that sort of these continual fights that some parts of the Republican Party have had with our speakers and current speaker have not been good. Thankfully, there was one that was majorly defeated this week, so hopefully that's a good sign that we won't have to deal with those anymore.
Coming into the 2024 legislative session, the stability of the public employees retirement system was front of mind for leaders in both chambers. Last week, their PERS bill became law. It strips away power from the elected PERS board. They now have to bring employer rate contribution increases in the form of a recommendation to the legislature. This came after the board voted to raise employer contribution rates by 5%. That's a move that many Mississippi mayors said they could not afford without raising taxes. 12 News' Richard Lake spoke at length about PERS with Hattiesburg Mayor Toby Barker.
The bill also cuts down that rate increase. It calls for an increase of just half a percentage point every year for the next 5 years.
I think both sides saw the need as they heard from cities and school districts on how much this was going to cost them. A half point every year for the next 5 years is certainly more palatable to cities, counties, and school districts than having 5 points all in 3 years.
Hattiesburg Mayor Toby Barker serves as the president of the Mississippi Municipal League, and he's appealed directly to his former legislative colleagues on this issue, especially as a new fifth tier.
The legislature is going to have to be more engaged in what's going on with PERS. If and when a fifth tier is created next session, which is part of that bill, you're really going to have to figure out a way to bridge the funding gap. But between now and when 25 years from now, when the fifth tier decides to retire, and so unfortunately, that means that we're going to have to keep hoping for really good returns in the market.
Executive Director of PERS Ray Higgins praised the legislature's efforts this year, but said in a statement, in part, quote, "Eventually, the system will need funding more consistent with the actuarial recommendations, and we should work together throughout the year for the betterment of PERS."
Questions about today's show or suggestion for an interview or segment, just drop us a line. Email our producers. The address is news@WJTV.com. Big thanks to Brandon Jones and Austin Barbour for joining us this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown from all of us here at 12 News. Make it a great weekend.